June 6, 1944, the light of dawn. The morning sky above Normandy was painted gray by clouds and smoke. Waves crashed violently against the shores as thousands of Allied soldiers approached the coast, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and determination. It was the day that would decide the fate of the world, D-Day. For years, Europe had been crushed under the iron fist of Nazi tyranny. One by one, nations had fallen to Hitler's war machine. But in the darkest hour, a plan was born, a plan to strike back, to liberate the continent from oppression. The code name, Operation Overlord. From the cold waters of the English Channel to the beaches of France, the Allies prepared for the greatest military invasion in history. British, American, and Canadian forces stood side by side, united under one purpose, to end the war and restore freedom. In London, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, made the final decision. After months of planning, deception, and waiting for the right weather, the order was given. "The eyes of the world are upon you," Eisenhower told his troops. "The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you." The night before the invasion, the skies filled with thousands of aircraft carrying paratroopers, their mission, to land behind enemy lines, destroy German defenses, and secure key bridges. The sea below them churned with warships ready to unleash their firepower at dawn. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing crafts touched the sand of Omaha Beach. What awaited the soldiers was beyond imagination, a wall of steel, bullets, and death. Yet, despite unimaginable losses, the Allied forces pushed forward. Step by bloody step, they climbed the cliffs, broke through enemy lines, and began the liberation of Europe. The cost was immense, thousands of lives lost in just a few hours. But their sacrifice lit the path to victory. The beaches of Normandy became sacred ground, where courage. As the guns thundered across Europe, the fate of nations was being shaped behind closed doors. Months before D-Day, in November 1943, three of the most powerful men in the world gathered in the Iranian capital, Tehran. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. The meeting marked the first time the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union sat together to decide how to crush Nazi Germany once and for all. The discussions were intense. The Allies agreed that the invasion of Western Europe would be launched in 1944, while the Soviets would strike from the east. This two-front assault would trap Hitler's armies and force the Third Reich toward inevitable destruction. Churchill pushed for attacks in the Mediterranean and southern Europe, seeking to strike Germany's soft underbelly. Stalin, eager for relief from the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, demanded the Western Allies open a second front in France as soon as possible. Roosevelt played the role of mediator, balancing the ambitions of both his partners while keeping focus on victory and the post-war world order. Beyond military plans, they discussed the future of Europe, the borders, the liberation of occupied nations, and the creation of an international body that could preserve peace. Though tensions and mistrust simmered beneath the surface, the Tehran Conference marked the beginning of an uneasy but crucial alliance that would shape the modern world. For the soldiers preparing for battle, the decisions made in Tehran were distant and abstract. But for the millions who suffered under occupation, they meant the promise of liberation, and the beginning of the end for Hitler's empire. While generals drew arrows on maps and diplomats exchanged coded words, in secret bases across England, men and women worked tirelessly, decoding German messages, building equipment, and perfecting strategies that would determine the fate of the free world. The countdown to D-Day.
Rommel wanted to fill the gaps between fortified cities with a continuous defensive line. He also demanded that more mines be planted along the coast. But a single mine was a drop in the ocean when one considers the distance from Calais to Lower Brittany. The French coastline stretched 750 miles. Rommel's renewed energy was not enough to worry Eisenhower, for the British and Americans had been constructing artificial harbors for months, meaning they would not need to seize a real port immediately, and would have flexibility in choosing their attack point. The Allies did not back down from the colossal task. These massive concrete boxes, called Phoenix units, would one day be towed off the coast of Normandy and sunk to form the first breakwaters. The same went for the floating piers, where tons of supplies needed by thousands of men would be unloaded once connected to huge steel pontoons that ensured access to the beaches, regardless of the tide. A gigantic, life-sized construction game was being designed in the ports of Britain. Meanwhile, in Britain, the training continued. The British and Americans used every available means, though once again everything revolved around the cameras. Synchronized swimming and fireworks became the order of the day. Equipment and materials were also tested. Mine-clearing tanks for beach operations, mats to make crossing the sand easier. There were even jeep obstacle courses on artificial terrain to train drivers to handle the new American vehicles. Not to mention Churchill's new crocodiles, flamethrower tanks that would incinerate anything missed by the preliminary bombardment. The Allies had already lost hundreds of men during training in Britain. Why then had they chosen such extreme training grounds in the remote depths of Cornwall? Even though the British 4th Commando Unit was a battle-hardened unit, they needed to simulate every possible topographical scenario. It was well known that Americans never went into battle unless the balance of power favored them. Coming from Utah, Kansas, Ohio, and Kentucky, how many of these young men even knew where Britain or France were on a map? How many suspected what awaited them on the beaches of Normandy? By February 1944, already 800,000 American soldiers were in Britain, with more arriving every week. Instantly, they found a taste of home, often provided by British servicewomen and, inevitably, cake. A first hint of sweetness, though perhaps more so as the days grew warmer. America continued extracting raw materials from deep underground, producing Sherman tanks designed to match the terrifying armor of the German army. Meanwhile, in the gray little towns of England, locals discovered the new P-38 Lightning bombers. Their range was greater than that of British aircraft. It was not always easy to make room for these newcomers, who had to be housed somewhere, even if that meant relocating entire families elsewhere, while children watched the scene in tears. Stereotypes grew stronger between the poor old British man and his spoiled American cousin, especially since his food rations were much higher than anything his British host could eat. But good relations persisted nonetheless, as in the seaside resort of Blackpool, where American servicemen relaxed while off duty, to the delight of local girls, and perhaps to the frustration of their absent husbands fighting the war. Never before in His Majesty's kingdom had there been such cases of divorce and illegitimate births as during that period. But wartime is wartime, and long live the British girls. Fraternization was the order of the day, and everything certainly seemed to be going according to plan. But there was more than dancing to win hearts. General Eisenhower always respected his allies. In March, he visited the prestigious Sandhurst Military Academy, where young Churchill once studied. Ike was determined to tell the young cadets what was expected of them. "Young men, you must win this war. It is up to you men to give your units, whether a tank crew, a platoon, or a company, every hour of every day. You must know each one of your men. It is not enough to be the best soldier in your unit. You must be the strongest, toughest, most resilient, and best technically trained. You must be their leader, their father, their guide. Then you will have done your duty and will be worthy of the traditions of this great school and your great country." These young British men were all in their early 20s, and Ike addressed them with his usual humanity, knowing that some of them would soon lose their lives fighting for a country that had proudly resisted the Nazis for 4 years.
In that same month of March, as D-Day approached, It was Churchill's turn to attend a full-scale training of American paratroopers in the presence of Eisenhower himself. British newsreel producers decided to go even further, using cameras on board the aircraft. "If it weren't for the cigar," one said, "I'd think this was the real thing." The man with the cigar had his own camera, and a smile as well. Later, several filmmakers would use footage from this training to represent the first American paratrooper landings in Normandy, which in reality were never actually filmed. More importantly, Churchill is now fully supporting Operation Overlord, despite his initial reservations. While the Allies were united and gathered in Britain, Hitler was far from operations at his eastern headquarters near the Soviet front, where still he continued to divide and rule. In the West, he split German command between Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of the Western Front, and Field Marshal Rommel, in charge of coastal defense. But the two men disagreed. Von Rundstedt wanted to keep his armored divisions inland so they could regroup in specific areas after the Allied landings. Rommel believed that British and American air power would paralyze German forces, so he wanted to bring the armored divisions as close to the coast as possible to confront the enemy during the landing. His wishes, however, were denied. Therefore, he focused on defending the beaches and installing anti-tank obstacles. He also built barriers against landing craft and chevaux de frise made from old railway tracks, making any advance almost impossible. He even altered the terrain itself to hinder landings and parachute drops. Whenever possible, the Germans flooded the lowlands just inland from the coast. In Devon, in southwest England, American infantry were training to land on a beach at the foot of a cliff, possibly held by the enemy. The first thing to do was establish a beachhead under the cliff face, to create a radio link for those following in the assault waves. Dig in to create cover. But to save your skin from enemy fire, young soldier, you'll need to show more enthusiasm. Wait for the right moment to gather your equipment and tend to the wounded. And what if, on D-Day, it's impossible to dig in to the shingle beach? What if the tide means staying hidden, unable to reach the wounded? As on future Omaha Beach, so similar to this one in Devon, the Americans would lose 3,000 men. The reason this beach so closely resembled the one the Americans were actually land on is because the Allies knew exactly what to expect. For weeks, with the help of the French resistance, often under severe repression, the Allies were able to obtain thousands of photographs of German defenses. Protected or not, the entire Channel coast was mapped in meticulous detail. Everything had been spotted and recorded. All the information that had been gathered and analyzed was merged into the attack plan designed by the Allied forces. Naturally, it remained highly classified, except perhaps for the vast quantities of information that were intentionally leaked to the Germans, or rather, disinformation. For months, the Allies had been feeding the enemy false details to lure them into believing in different landing locations, especially around the Pas-de-Calais region. In Britain, the deception continued with the creation of fake airfields directly opposite Calais, where inflatable aircraft appeared across the fields. Meanwhile, in other parts of southern England, where the majority of the forces were being assembled, supplies, weapons, and ammunition were carefully stockpiled. By May, however, it was no longer possible to conceal the immense scale of the preparations. Hundreds of thousands of men had been gathered in various camps to bring them closer to their embarkation points and were kept isolated from local civilians to prevent leaks. Yet officers mindful of maintaining morale relaxed the usual disciplinary requirements. In one squadron of the Royal Air Force, for example, they decided not to clip their pilots' wings before sending them off to crush the German Eagle in the heart of Normandy's countryside. Among all these men, those we would never see were the ones who documented the events themselves, students of the British Army Film School. All volunteers, tasked with capturing the preparations for future generations. The youngest of them, Desmond O'Neill, only 20 years old, was determined to cover D-Day. Like his comrades, he held the rank of sergeant, the ideal rank to stay close to the men. "My camera was welcomed," he later said. "It distracted them." On May 27th, a new currency was introduced to his fellow soldiers: French francs printed by the Allies, which infuriated General Charles de Gaulle. He saw it as a violation of French sovereignty, arguing that only France should have the right to print or mint its own money. But at that time, he remained out of the loop and had no idea what was being planned. The men knew they had a strong chance of being killed, and that created a strange mood, as O'Neill later noted. Another military cameraman, Sergeant Ian Grant, 27 years old, always wore his Scottish cap. He had joined the film unit to escape domestic chores and to immortalize the memory of his brothers in arms. On May 31st, Grant filmed them as they received the booklet that told them about the country they were soon to invade. "It was in this camp," he later recalled, "that we first discovered our target was Normandy." He also filmed the few extra rations that were distributed to the men as they prepared for the worst, because it was now a matter of days. In June, Norman Clegg, another cameraman who unfortunately left behind only his clapperboard, filmed the final instructions being given to his company. He shot from above, as if already risking himself, to avoid revealing the location where his comrades would land. Even they had no idea where Ouistreham was in Normandy. Everything was still top secret, and that's why they had remained in total isolation for the past 2 weeks. By then, papers had been distributed to Clegg and his fellow cameramen as they moved toward the ports, the beginning of their great adventure. The U.S. Army was perfectly equipped. With 1.5 million men, the number of American troops in southern England exceeded that of their British counterparts. In early June, hundreds of thousands of men left their camps as local civilians gathered to bid farewell to their new heroes. All were heading toward their respective embarkation points, 19 ports along England's southern coast. While British forces moved eastward, American soldiers went west. The next time they would leave those ships, it would be onto land. The Canadians, under British command and forming the third largest Allied contingent, contributed 21,000 men. 20,000 vehicles were loaded into the ship holds so they could drive onto the beaches as quickly as possible, an extraordinary task in itself. Not to mention the thousands of tons of supplies that had to be transported within the first 2 days. To give his invasion plan every chance of success, General Eisenhower considered several crucial factors, chief among them the combination of night and a full moon to ensure maximum visibility, and a half-tide at dawn for the landings. In June, only the 5th, 6th, or 7th would meet those conditions. To surprise the enemy, the earlier in the day, the better. Ike decided the landings would take place on June 5th. But in the days leading up to the 5th, the weather deteriorated. On June 4th, as ships stationed in northern England began to head toward the Channel, a violent storm broke out. Eisenhower was forced to recall all the vessels that had already set sail. Operation Overlord was under threat. Any movement made so far could have alerted the Germans. Day and night, Ike and his team stayed in constant contact with the meteorological office, but the news was not good. The forecasts were poor for the next 2 weeks. That could lead to disaster. The men would need to be remotivated, and the campaign could be shortened by 2 weeks. In the ports, where Eisenhower had been forced to delay the departure, the waiting became unbearable. The landing craft circled restlessly like crocodiles in a flooded pit. That day, June 4th, Desmond O'Neill was at work among his British comrades of the 3rd Division, under winds that seemed as though they would never stop. He made the following note: "We sat there inside the aircraft. Since we had nothing to do but eat and smoke, and we didn't like the food, I had 10 men's rations all to myself." A mood of bitter disappointment took hold, because they still didn't know where they were going, other than that they were about to cross the Channel. Later, they told us we would land in Lyon-sur-Mer, but that meant nothing to any of us.
The Canadians, known for their devout Christianity, perhaps prayed harder than ever for the help they would soon need. Never before had religious services seen such large crowds as on Sunday, June 4, 1944, in every port across southern England. At the same time, the Americans tried to keep busy, knowing that nothing wears men down than idleness, which could make them even more vulnerable when the big day came. On the evening of June 4th, the weather forecast grew slightly less pessimistic. The seas were expected to calm by the 5th and 6th. That night, in just 30 minutes, Eisenhower made a decision that would change the course of the world. The fleet would sail on June 6th, 1944.
On June 5th, the massive machinery of war began to move. Allied aircraft struck northern and western France to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. The bombers were not precise in their targets. They bombed lower Normandy for 3 full days, killing nearly 4,000 Germans and civilians. The air raids led to heated discussions between Eisenhower and Churchill. The latter was deeply concerned about the resentment such destruction would create among the French population. But to the Allies' surprise, the French resistance responded, "This is war and we must accept the deaths of our people." On June 3rd in Algiers, General de Gaulle transformed the French National Liberation Committee into the provisional government of the French Republic. Until then, he had remained silent. The Allies had kept everything secret from the French. But as the liberation of France drew near, the British and Americans needed de Gaulle's support to ensure full cooperation between the French people and the resistance. On June 4th, after being summoned by Churchill, de Gaulle left for Britain, determined to make his voice heard. He refused to allow the Allies to impose the law on France. Yet, despite being denied full authority, the sensitive general ultimately agreed to support Operation Overlord. On June 5th, at sea, diversionary tactics were still being used. Dozens of small ships steamed north toward Le Havre, their chimneys spewing smoke to create a deceptive screen and make the Germans believe a massive fleet was crossing the channel toward a point far north of the actual Normandy beaches. General Eisenhower had always believed that a commander's place was beside his men before and during battle. Late in the afternoon of June 5th, at Greenham Common Airfield, just hours before takeoff, he visited the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, who would be among the first to set foot on French soil. Ike's smiling face hid the tension within him. That alone was reason enough for the paratroopers to act brave and reassure their leader. That evening, Eisenhower stayed until the end, until the very last plane had taken off. A bit farther away, without their commander there to encourage them in person, the Pathfinder paratroopers found their own way to show courage. Whether they were real Native Americans or simply living out the white man's legend of the American Indian warrior, the war paint, bright red on the faces of these Iroquois in their 20s and 30s, helped them prepare for the fight. Those who did not wear war paint simply blackened their faces with charcoal to make themselves less visible. In addition to their weapons and parachutes, these men carried radio transmitters to mark precise drop zones for the gliders that would deliver the main forces. It took 3 men to help a single paratrooper board his aircraft. Each of them had only a 50% chance of survival, and they knew it. That same night, Ike wrote a letter to be delivered in case the landings ended in disaster, a testament to how uncertain the Allies still were about everything. "It was my decision to attack at this time," he wrote. "Based on the best available information, if there is any blame or error in the attempt, it is mine alone." For weeks, the Allies had been working to complete a solid plan. On the night of June 5th, the German coastal defenses were to be bombed. At dawn, naval artillery would begin firing from 45 miles offshore. The British and Canadians would take the right flank of the invasion. 3 beaches were assigned to them: Sword, Juno, and Gold, located between Ouistreham and Arromanches. The Americans would take the left flank, landing on Omaha and Utah beaches. The British had to capture the city of Caen as quickly as possible. It served as an important communication hub through which the Germans could bring reinforcements. It also opened onto flat terrain that would allow Allied armored divisions to spread out and aircraft to land on temporary airfields. The Americans, in turn, would move toward Cherbourg, which they planned to capture in a week, so that hundreds of thousands of additional men could land with all the necessary supplies for the next phase of the offensive. On June 6th, at 3:15 a.m., Allied aircraft began bombing German positions in every sector of the landings. At dawn, naval artillery took on the task of smashing the Atlantic Wall. Omaha Beach, near the town of Colville-sur-Mer, was the first target. The Americans had to quickly establish a beachhead and then join their comrades at Utah, before advancing together toward Cherbourg. But many air raids missed their targets, arriving too early or too late, and the naval artillery did little better. The early landing hour, determined by the tides, did not allow enough time to destroy the Atlantic Wall successfully. The main weight of the attack fell upon seasoned soldiers of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division.
116th Regiment attached to them consisted of young men who had never been under fire before. To stay out of enemy range, the landing craft were launched in rough seas far from the coast. The men were packed in like sardines. Robert Capa, the only photographer present that day, recalled, "When the first shell whistled over our heads, we lay in the vomit on the deck without seeing the shore approach." Barely ashore, the men were greeted by an almost intact German defense. It was like shooting turkeys in a barrel. The wind caused the tide to rise earlier than expected, and the next assault waves failed to weaken Rommel's defenses, forcing the men to abandon their boats in deep water. Unable to advance, they huddled together in the middle of the beach, sending out the same chilling message over and over, pinned down by enemy artillery, closer to crucified than alive, as shown in the few surviving photos from Capa, the rest destroyed by accident. Strong currents pushed the landing craft off course. Men drowned under the weight of their gear pulling them down. The sea turned red, and Omaha Beach would later be known as Bloody Omaha. The U.S. command even considered canceling the attack, a desperate measure that would have meant abandoning those already on the shore to their fate. Hundreds were already dead or wounded. Their sacrifice would have been in vain. Stopping the operation would have opened a huge gap in the Allied front just as the massive war machine was moving at full speed. On the morning of June 6th, the dawn revealed a fleet of 7,000 ships approaching the Normandy coast. As always, Eisenhower was not far away. At 9:45 a.m., he addressed the world through the BBC. "I call upon all free men to stand with us now. Keep your faith strong. It is our honor and our vision. Together, we shall achieve victory." Across a 45-mile front, there was practically one boat every 250 meters, protected by an air cover of 11,000 aircraft. All were painted with white stripes to prevent friendly fire from Allied gunners. Fortunately, not all sectors along the coast were like Omaha. The Germans, victims of the Allied deception campaign, still believed that the main attack would come at Calais and were struggling to regroup. The supposedly unbreakable Atlantic Wall began to crumble. German anti-aircraft defenses were also under attack. That day, Allied aircraft carried out 10,000 sorties without serious losses. While B-26 bombers dropped their final loads inland, fighter planes joined the battle. Not only coastal defenses but also airfields were targeted to keep the remaining enemy planes grounded. Communication centers, roads, bridges, and railways were systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, the French resistance was in full action, sabotaging lines and helping guide the invading forces toward their objectives.
After completing their intelligence and sabotage missions, they launched an attack to prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to the front. The combined efforts of the Allies and the Resistance made it difficult for German forces summoned from Brittany and south of the Loire to advance. Rommel, who had insisted from the beginning on positioning his men near the beaches to confront the invasion, was proven right. The British 3rd Infantry Division was advancing towards Sword Beach, tasked with neutralizing defenses at Ouistreham and capturing Caen the same day. This Scottish unit from the 45th Royal Marine Commando was photographed during the landing by their fellow countryman, Corporal Ian Grant. He wrote, "This is the real thing. I photographed the enormous fleet as best I could, more or less at sea level. We were provided with decent rations and even seasickness pills, but with diesel fumes, most men, even the strongest, became ill. The sky was black with planes. Some were directed to fly low so we could identify them over loudspeakers and distinguish them from enemy aircraft. The men were told to ignore the cameras as much as possible. They were natural actors, absorbed in their thoughts, living their own experiences." Grant was not afraid. There was no fear on their faces, only the desire to get out of the bloody landing craft that made them seasick. The closer they got to shore, the louder the chaos. As they charged, the slope broke, and everyone gathered along the Roman path. All one could do was descend as best as possible under the weight of a backpack pulling downward. Grant and the others survived the first assault. For them, the hardest part was about to begin, joining the paratroopers who had landed behind enemy lines. Another photographer was already on Sword Beach. The youngest, Corporal O'Neill, had arrived 45 minutes before Grant and captured the final moments of the battle. In the midst of the gray smoke, everything seemed unreal. This was not a battle one could imagine
or see in a film. The beach exits were crowded. Landing was nearly impossible. He followed the infantry, trying to get out. At this point, the shaky camera indicates that O'Neill had been shot. He only had time to film a few final scenes before being evacuated home for medical care. Farewell, Corporal O'Neill, and well done to all the men who captured Sword that day, at the cost of 600 killed and wounded, most barely in their 20s. Captured Germans were gathered on the beaches. A few miles away, Juno Beach, in the Canadian sector, had the mission of seizing Carpiquet, Caen's airfield. What were these young soldiers thinking after traveling 5,000 miles to land at Bernier, a small, little-known coastal resort in Normandy? These are shots of the first wave of the attack, the only footage captured during the landing, but by an automatic camera mounted on a bull. Even the cold mechanical eye could not miss a simple human gesture. Shortly after, the first French house in Normandy was liberated, a victory that cost the lives of 100 men, which Allied photographers were instructed not to film. It was better to focus on the first German prisoners and the anger shown by a proud Frenchman toward them. German surrender did nothing to hide the challenges faced by the men at Juno Beach, where the rough sea caused problems for the second wave of landings. 300 young Canadian soldiers lost their lives. Their sacrifice was not in vain. After securing the beachhead, the survivors advanced inland toward Caen. Their first reward came in the form of young French women delighted to see their country liberated by these men, many of whom spoke French, albeit with a funny accent. Meanwhile, at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, despite Admiral Ramsay's proud smile at the roll of his fleet, General Eisenhower still appeared concerned. From dawn, he had been receiving message after message, some alarming, like those from Omaha, some encouraging, like those from Utah or the British sector. From Eisenhower's expression, one could tell the battle was far from over. 6 hours after landing at Omaha, the men were still trapped at the foot of the cliffs. The Americans always did their best for their men, ensuring that any additional backup was ready. Even the first assault waves were accompanied by a skilled medical corps, prepared to care for the wounded immediately, including the enemy. First aid had never been as critical as at bloody Omaha, where the dead lay alongside a handful of prisoners. 3,000 Americans lost their lives on the 5 most dangerous landing beaches. Yet later in the day, with the sun shining and the first waves having established beachheads and pushed inland, more forces began arriving at Omaha. Finally, it could be said that the landings were successful. Now the focus shifted to the next battle, for Normandy and France. 2 days later, General Montgomery arrived, and he had reason to worry. He always wanted to maintain an overwhelming balance of force before taking any action. He had delayed deploying his armored divisions and had failed to capture Caen as planned on the first day. Furthermore, his forces, relieved to have landed with relatively little damage, seemed to lack aggressiveness. Their photographer captured this in some way, roaming to film the first funny French civilians who were asked to pose for the cause and seemed more than happy to oblige. On this day, June 8th, Norman Clegg, the man with the wooden board, died. He had filmed the first moments of calm when the German prisoners and wounded had nothing to fear from their former enemies. 5 days later, Clegg would be killed by German fire. For him, there would be no distinction between mercy and misfortune. Yet these shots also show how the British relaxed the day after Victory Day, a slackness the Germans exploited fully. Although German forces had withdrawn from the front as ordered by von Rundstedt and could not reinforce their comrades on the beaches, they now reacted. 2 armored divisions, including the famed 12th Panzer Hitler Division, launched a counterattack on June 7th, 8th, and 9th, blocking the British and Canadians' advance toward Caen. They also fortified positions outside the city, rendering air raids ineffective. Although this allowed German propaganda to show that their soldiers were suffering the same fate as the city's residents, the German army maintained control of the town. For the early refugees, the approach of liberators meant they had to leave. The German counterattack also succeeded in isolating several Allied paratrooper units. Often dropped in inaccurate locations, they could not communicate with comrades advancing inland from the sea. Many were captured, though few appeared resigned to their fate. The American airborne forces lost more than half their equipment, and 1 in every 5 men. All these men paid a high price for the honor of being the first to set foot on French soil. However, their wide dispersion succeeded at least in keeping the Germans confused, making them believe the number of men dropped was much larger than in reality. It was now the turn of the 81st Airborne Division to be buried before receiving a final salute from their comrades in arms. On June 9th, the Americans captured the small town of Isigny, subjected to heavy shelling to drive the Germans out permanently. The German defense of Isigny had prevented the Omaha forces from linking up with Utah and continuing the push toward Cherbourg. But with Isigny secured, the Allied front was reunited, stretching 60 miles from Ouistreham to the tip of the beach at Cotentin. Behind the ruins, where were the residents of Isigny looking? Perhaps farther, toward the sea, where the French ship was finally crossing the channel. With the Allies firmly positioned along the coasts, it was time to bring in General de Gaulle, leader of the Provisional French government. Charles de Gaulle never liked needing help, and his step onto French soil in Courseulles after 4 years of exile was no exception. The day before, Churchill, still wary of de Gaulle, had written to Montgomery, "I must insist that you receive a visit from General de Gaulle. I do not think you should salute him on the beach. It is enough for him to reach your headquarters." De Gaulle would spend only 1 day in France. Time was tight for him as well. It was time to tell Montgomery what he wanted to hear, and the British Marshal even allowed him to take center stage. Montgomery also assigned Norman Johnson, his personal videographer, the task of following de Gaulle, perhaps to monitor him. Although Johnson was used to working according to his leader's whims, he also thought de Gaulle's story was compelling. He said it was difficult to follow him, but fortunately, de Gaulle was tall. He always had the same serious expression, yet he created a good atmosphere. He always ignored the camera, or at least pretended to. In short, a star in the making. In Bayeux, people everywhere were happy to finally see the French free from German oppression, a sign of renewed sovereignty. De Gaulle was particularly eager to show himself to his people and the members of the resistance without any British or American presence before heading to the town hall where he stationed his men.
de Gaulle did not mention the Allies. He prevented them from expressing opinions on French political choices and forced them to recognize his authority in the country. Although the troops no longer needed landing ports, they now required artificial harbors to continue the battle and provide logistics and supplies for hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. Every day, 150 to 200 ships unloaded around 7,000 vehicles, 15,000 tons of supplies, and thousands of men at the port of Arromanches on the British side and Omaha on the American side. But soon the weather worsened again, threatening the operation. Normandy had not seen a storm like this in 40 years. Within the harbors, ships were tossed by the waves like rag dolls. The blockades of Crates could not withstand the disaster, and worse, some were swept away, allowing the waves to flood the port. Floating docks and wooden walkways were torn apart and carried away by the water. The storm lasted a full 4 days, halting the supply of materials and reinforcements. On the morning of June 23rd, clear skies revealed a pitiful scene of hundreds of ships and debris stranded along the beaches. Although British engineers quickly rebuilt the port at Arromanches, the American port at Omaha remained out of service. The plan was delayed by 10 days. The American forces had to capture the deep-water port of Cherbourg as quickly as possible. Although the city was besieged, it remained in German hands. Finally, on June 26th, the American infantry entered the suburbs. That same day, in front of the assembled press, it was clear that the garrison commander, Lieutenant General von Schlieben, had surrendered. Although this giant man politely scraped his feet before his victor, the young General Collins, he nevertheless reneged on his oath to Hitler, preferring death over the disgrace of surrender. Von Schlieben even surrendered before his men, who did not lay down their arms until the following day. The Americans were not always kind to prisoners, which was somewhat understandable. By Victory Day, they had already lost 22,000 men. The average age of the prisoners, some elderly, some very young, reflected the retreat of the German army in the west, while its younger and more battle-hardened forces were deployed in the east, fighting the Red Army.
6,000 prisoners in Cherbourg were a massive number in terms of what cameras could capture, though they often caught us off guard and left a lasting impression. With the capture of Cherbourg, one of the last sections of the Atlantic Wall collapsed. Unlike the faces of their men, these captured officers maintained a degree of arrogance, or was it perhaps shame? After Cherbourg, Hitler decided to personally oversee the German army in the west. He dismissed von Rundstedt, who had suggested a ceasefire, and replaced him with the more respected Marshal von Kluge. Rommel, frustrated with the Führer's harsh policies, realized that all he could do now was delay the final catastrophe. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was also concerned. Yes, the Americans had taken Cherbourg, but Montgomery had not yet captured Caen, the planned launch point for the assault on the German lines. With the Germans entrenched inland, they had the advantage of space and the ability to supply and reinforce. Meanwhile, the Allies remained pinned along the Channel coast. The Americans had no choice but to break through the enemy front and Cotentin. This was no easy task in an area filled with orchards, where defensive hedgerows made the terrain advantageous for the enemy. Seeing without being seen was a huge advantage for the Germans in a battle for which no young American was prepared. In this vast, chessboard-like maze, a small group of steadfast fighters could stop an entire battalion. When they allowed themselves to land in one of these square fields, they simply had to retreat to the flanks. American tanks were forced to remain on the roads, making them easy targets. Just as when they crossed the dikes, they exposed their unarmored bellies to enemy fire. These traps caused the deaths of thousands in the army and led to a failed attempt to penetrate what would come to be called that cursed state. With the Americans struggling, the British simply had to take the city of Caen. Finally, Montgomery decided to use overwhelming force and requested support from the Royal Air Force. Over 2,500 tons of bombs were dropped on the city. Some bombs hit their targets, some did not. There was no point in looking at each other. This was war. After 2 days of fierce fighting, 115,000 British soldiers entered the eastern part of the city, by then 3/4 destroyed. On July 13th, Montgomery arrived in the city. It had taken him more than a month to capture only part of Caen, a city he had hoped to take on the first day to prepare the Allied push inland. And clearly, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Although the residents raised the Cross of Lorraine, most of the city remained in German hands. Yet that did not prevent British propaganda from making people believe that the inhabitants of the city of 1,000 towers and the British forces were happily toasting together. Goodbye. Thanks again. Don't mention it. It was my pleasure. But was this intense bombing and the death of 1,000 people truly necessary due to the positioning of German defenses around the city? The debate continues to this day. Every man and woman reacted in their own way. Who was that German playing the organ in the destroyed Normandy church? A madman? A filthy Jerry? A lover of music? Or a lost soldier of Hitler, now burdened with his leader's excesses, simply seeking a momentary escape from the scene of the Holocaust? A few days later, it was the turn of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to arrive. He wanted to personally inspect the ongoing operations in the Caen sector. But despite Montgomery's skill as a good tour guide, he controlled only his car, not the aircraft car, which was still under German control. 10 days after the city was captured, the British had still not broken through the German lines, and Churchill's visit was insufficient to change that reality. For Eisenhower, who had hoped to achieve a breakthrough in this sector, it was a resounding failure, given the tremendous resources employed. The Supreme Commander placed increasing trust in 3-star General Omar Bradley, who had organized the Omaha and Utah landings before capturing Cherbourg. Eisenhower appreciated his calm, clarity of mind, and effectiveness. Bradley believed the Americans could break through enemy lines in Cotontin. Operation Code Word Cobra, like a snake striking backwards, then going for the temporal vein. To help his men exit the Bocage region, Bradley planned to crush German positions along the front line with precise bombing raids. Once the breach occurred, his forces would simultaneously advance toward Brittany, the Seine, and the Loire. On July 25th, Allied bombers attacked the road between Saint-Lô and Pierry, where the two armies confronted each other. General Lair's famous armored division, second in command after Marshal Rommel, was eliminated. American forces finally managed to leave the hell of Bocage, forcing the inhabitants out. This was the long-awaited gap in the enemy front line. Furthermore, seeing the number of prisoners, they carried out a successful roundup, even if many of those captured were minors. In the monster-filled Normandy, tanks were now equipped with blades to cut hedgerows and cross the last miles of Bocage. Even before July ended, once the breach was achieved, the American armored divisions reached Coutances, Avranches, and Granville, the last port in Normandy before Brittany. In early August, the French 2nd Armored Division landed at Utah Beach. For months, even years, these Frenchmen had left everything behind to fight the Germans and Italians in North Africa. This time, they were ready to achieve victory on their beloved French soil. They were led by General Leclerc, thin as a rod, but brave and upright. This aristocrat possessed all the qualities that had made him side with Vichy. Yet he had chosen to follow de Gaulle since June 1940. Now he landed as a liberator of his homeland. His division was integrated into the U.S. Third Army, where he could finally participate in operations on French soil. General Bradley's headquarters, in front of the lens of American director George Stevens, showed Montgomery, as always camera-savvy, decorating a handful of Yankee soldiers, a skill he was good at.
Under pressure from Eisenhower, the British Marshal agreed to let the Americans organize the final battle. To ensure a successful outcome, Bradley also relied on a general pattern. The man with the .45 caliber pistol in his holster is ambitious. At the first whiff, he expects to be taken off his ship, a sentiment famously quoted as, "And so it is."
At dawn, the Germans made one last attempt to roll the dice. From Caen, they launched a counterattack at Mortain, hoping to push the Allies back into the sea. The attack, personally planned by Hitler, was quickly contained by Allied aircraft. It had no chance of success. Von Kluge wrote before taking his own life, this would be the last German offensive in the West. Worse for the Germans at Mortain, Bradley deliberately allowed the enemy to penetrate the Allied flank. They were now trapped by Americans in the south and by the British in the north. Finally, Bradley could execute the long-planned maneuver to catch the enemy in a pincer movement between his forces. The advancing British from the Caen Plain and the American armies in the south were encircling the retreating Germans between Argentan and Falaise. Once the German counterattack at Mortain halted, Patton and his forces moved toward the Le Mans, heading for Paris. But some units suddenly turned toward Argentan, executing a wide sweeping maneuver that encircled the Germans. Meanwhile, in the north, the Anglo-Canadians formed the main Allied axis. The German army was destroyed. Later, Eisenhower described the battlefield at Falaise as the largest bloodbath ever witnessed in any war zone. He added that only Dante could describe it. But for hundreds of meters, uninterrupted, he walked over dead and rotting bodies. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Germans were killed. Judging by the appearance of the prisoners, Ike was not exaggerating. It would take several days to evacuate 30,000 to 40,000 prisoners of war from Falaise. For them, captivity was a victory. Life was better than death. The German army had rallied men from the countries it occupied, and not all were prepared to defend the Third Reich with their lives. The German army in Normandy had ended. With the first battle of Falaise and the sending off of prisoners, Patton's armies crossed the Seine and Loire rivers. Eisenhower had now reached the geographical limits defined in Operation Overlord. He was ready to move to the next step, pushing toward Germany itself. On August 19th, a cloud of smoke hung over Paris. On the ground, with news of the approaching Allies, the city rose up. Yet it was the German army itself that decided to abandon the French capital. Viewed from above, one could see convoy after convoy leaving Paris, heading east, paying little attention to roadblocks. These were scenes from a real event that would long remain in memory. 5 Germans were caught in the flames. This does not diminish the courage of the men and women who had risen against the occupiers before the Allies arrived, dozens of whom died fighting the retreating German army. The next day, de Gaulle appeared at Eisenhower's headquarters. Ike wanted to avoid turning Paris into another battlefield. He preferred to encircle the capital, force the Germans to surrender, and pluck the city like ripe fruit. But the eloquent French leader succeeded in convincing Eisenhower to enter the city, both to avoid a potential bloodbath and to suppress the rise of communist resistance members. Ike agreed, and Bradley approved that the 2nd Armored Division, led by Leclerc and famed at Falaise, would be the first unit to enter Paris and accept the German surrender. After several fierce battles south of the capital, the skies over the suburbs turned blue. Women wore red, men wore white shirts, forming a tricolor world to welcome Leclerc's boys at the gates of Paris. And now within the city itself, it was time to rejoice. On that day, the gamble of the man who had rallied the French people on June 18, 1940, had paid off. A miracle had occurred. France, once crushed and humiliated, now stood side by side with the victors. Now it was time for the victory parade on the Champs-Élysées to cement the legend. But this is a story very much French.
Our story ends the following day in the less glamorous Place de la Concorde. At the head of a country whose political future remained uncertain, de Gaulle requested that Eisenhower recognize his authority before the French people. Ike, as did General Bradley, complied willingly. Yet humility alone kept him in the background while de Gaulle remained front and center. Eisenhower was determined to organize a march in front of the American forces who would continue the fight against the Third Reich. The Americans had wisely understood that in the post-war period, with a politically divided world, they would need France on their side in Europe. Our story was full of color, but the original footage was often black and white. In the end, whether color or monochrome, every frame told the fate of all those men who took part in the Normandy landings, many of them anonymous among the collective forces. Who were you, lost among the crowd of faces? Or were you the one turning away? Who are you? Thank you.